Everybody, welcome back to Cutthroat Commander. I'm your host Tim, and this week we are featuring Thada Adel Inquisitor as the commander. And I'm sorry to keep doing this, but it appears we will have another control on control mirror. The generals, obviously Thada Adel on my commander side, and Medomei the Ageless on the other side. For those of you who have not seen this commander, is a legendary Sphinx for 4 white blue. 4/4 flyer. Basically, whenever it hits me, combat damage to a player, he gets an extra turn after this one. The catch being that you can't string together turns. If you're on an extra turn already, you can't use Medomei to further snowball, or else it'd essentially be a 1-card combo. Still, when he gets rolling, that allows you to basically have 2 turns for every turn your opponent has. So, brief matchup analysis to keep along with this theme. Medomei has several advantages against a deck like mine. One is white carries several decent cards for removing problematic permanents on my side of the board. Some of my enchantments, like Omniscience, which is sitting in my hand, are Future Sight. He does have a way to deal with. Also, extremely cheap spot removal like Swords to Plowshares is great against my commander. It allows him to interact with my commander in a way that I do not have the advantage in a way that I can't replicate. Once that Medomei is down on his side, it is kind of difficult for me to deal with it. I do have one answer in my hand with this Tameo. There's bounce effects. I can Shackles it, I guess. But ultimately, I don't have the spot removal that white offers. So in that regard, that's an advantage that his general does have. On the flip side, mine almost certainly will never be blocked. He does have spot removal for it, but if it gets down and gets under that spot or dodges that spot removal, it's going to be hitting him a lot. And blue-white deck, there's a fair chance that there's plenty of artifacts I can use. So, looking at my hand, it's okay. I mean, the Omniscience obviously isn't going to get cast for a considerable length of time, if ever. However, this does have an extremely valuable card in these control mirrors, and that is Sensei's Divining Top. And I say it's a control mirror. Yes, I guess it's possible his deck plays a bunch of, aggressive cards, aggressive white, Monastery Mentor, Delver Secrets, Thalia, God knows what, but in reality, almost every time I've played this general, it's been kind of a very control-ish build. So, Sensei's Divining Top will really shine there. And as we'll see through the replay, it probably single-handedly wins me this game. So, I do keep this hand, and he just leads off with a Tranquil Cove. So that does, in theory, give him blue mana without opening himself to Thada Adel. And I just follow that up with a Sensei's Divining Top. Alright, so here I choose to simply, rather than activate the top on upkeep, since I'm not really doing anything this turn, I choose to at least bluff the counterspell and end of my turn do this. What you probably missed there real quick, there's a Tabernacle, which isn't going to do much, a Mind Stone, and a Sky Diamond. I don't need the extra mana from the Mind Stone next turn, so I choose to grab the Sky Diamond instead. And it's clear that he might have a counter here, so rather than try and run Thada Adel out, I just run the Sky Diamond out, since he's much less likely to waste a counter on that. He plays Azorius Cluestone, and I don't top because I know what I'm drawing and I'm fine with it. I probably should have in hindsight. Now here, something very bad happens. I try and play the Tameo to lock down his mana, and I get Mana Tithe. You can argue all day about whether that is the correct play or not, but in Magic, there is 5 cards, realistically maybe 5, 6 cards in Magic Seven cards in Magic that can stop that thing. Commandeer, Force of Will, Daze, that counter you discard 2 islands, Force Spike, Mana Tithe, and Spell Pierce. And out of those, Force of Will is the only one that sees a ton of play. But I walk into this and get hit by Mana Tithe. So that tells me a couple important things. One, it tells me his deck is probably also running Force Spike, so that's something to keep in mind. And 2, it tells me his deck in general is probably going pretty deep on the cheap counters. So it's something to watch out for. And tells his deck is probably a little reactive, although cheap counters like that do allow him to play threats and protect them. So now he has a big window, but doesn't have any more land. So I catch a break there. Alright, here I have this Tabernacle, which isn't going to do anything, so I play the Riptide Laboratory, and then the Mind Stone, and he lets it resolve. And then I try Worn Power Stone. And my guess is correct in that he is going super deep on counters when I get hit by Mind Static, which is one, I'll be honest, I was not overly familiar with. It looks basically just like a double mana leak, which is fine. Worn Power Stone would have been nice, but it's better that he uses counters on things like that rather than my actual threats. Since right now, I'm a little threat light with that Tamiyo getting Force Spiked. So here he plays the Hallowed Fountain untapped, signaling even more counters, and I top at end of turn. And you see Island, Talrand, Preordain. I choose to keep the Preordain. The Talrand is tempting, but the chances of it resolving and dodging spot removal are pretty slim. I choose to try and find some action instead and send both to the bottom. And sure enough, I get Jace the Mind Sculptor. And Jace, yeah, obviously brainstorming every turn is great, but even better is he's a little constricted on mana relative to his commander. He isn't able to play his commander and protect him at the same time, probably. Meaning, if he slams his commander, I slam Jace, bounce it, and have a huge, huge tempo advantage that's going to be very difficult for him to overcome. So here, I top again since it's a fresh set of cards, and see these 3 cards. And this is where top single-handedly wins me the game. So he's clearly playing Drago. And I do not have much in the way of proactive threats to overcome that. So, at this point, I make a decision. I'm going to set up, in order to resolve one of my big spells, either Jace or Omniscience, I'm going to keep this Temporal Mastery floating as the top card. That way, at the end of his turn, I can set it up. For those of you who don't know, Temporal Mastery is a Time Walk effect, but it's one that can miracle for 1 and a blue, meaning if it's the first card drawn on that turn, you can cast it for its miracle cost. So for those of you who haven't seen miracles in Legacy, the way this works is if I keep floating that as the top card, at the end of his turn, I can tap out for top, actually not tap out for top, tap top to draw a card. Since it's the first card I drew on my opponent's turn, I get to cast this super cheap for 2 mana, and that will force a reaction out of his hand. For him. He can either counter that or let me take 2 turns in a row, which allows me to do some powerful things like play and swing with my general or land one of these threats. So yeah, I decide to keep those floating. And Devastation Tide is also an important panic button. Alright, so I initially screw up and think, oh, I'll just Temporal Mastery next turn. Then I have the realization to keep it floating. So end of turn, stack it again, so I draw that Impulse. That Impulse isn't going to do me a lot of good because I want to keep that Temporal Mastery on top of the library. And here, he didn't cast his General, so he's clearly respecting the counter spell. So I decide just to cast my General and see how that goes. And he casts yet another obscure counter. He casts Dismiss, or Bone to Ash. That's fine. Unfortunately, like if he's running those counters, there's a good chance he's playing all the normal ones as well. So I realize it might be tough to resolve a threat, especially since he's not tapping out for his commander here. So I mistakenly don't do this on my end step. I flip these cards again and draw another card that's good, but I can't use quite yet because I want to preserve having Temporal Mastery on top of my library. And Ponder makes it a little tricky to do that. And there's no reason I have to cast it right now. And it forces him to waste his mana as well. So I keep floating, draw a land, which is kind of what I'm looking for, and pass the turn again. And he plays another land, and we do this one more time. And Propaganda, it's not great, but it's something I can cast right away without really exposing myself, hoping maybe I'll bait a counter out of it, but I don't. Obviously, that can help choke his mana if he does decide to try and get his commander down. Alright, here he goes to cast his commander and then decides not to. So I just wait to see what he cleans up. He discards Crippling Chill, which obviously isn't doing anything in this game, since my commander is unlikely to stick around on the board anyway. During my upkeep, I do this float and get a Temporal Manipulation as the new card in the mix, which is good, because that helps set up that busted... it helps set up that situation where I squeeze him between the Time Walk effect and a powerful spell. And here I grab Stoker Genius, a third card that is great in this sort of matchup, but not right now since I can't afford to draw a bunch of cards and get that Temporal Mastery off the top. He plays Monastery Siege, which is kind of bad for me. It allows him to filter out cards that aren't doing anything, like that Hidden Strings. So I spin the top. Mox Diamond, obviously a dead draw, so I choose to draw the Tide. I can get it back if I need to using Jace the Mind Sculptor's ability. Here I try and play my General again, seeing if it'll stick. And it appears to stick. And he casts Bonds of Faith, which is basically a pacifism effect on non-humans. And that's fine. Luckily, I don't have to do anything special to get rid of my General to recast. I float my top again, grab Coalition Relic, which is a good draw. And on my upkeep, I let Tabernacle get rid of my Thada Adel. It'll be a while before casting him again. 7 mana is a little pricey. Instead, I'm just content to build up my mana further with Coalition Relic. And my opponent clearly doesn't seem keen, if he has them, to use counterspells on these mana rocks, which is fine by me. He's stuck kind of between a rock and a hard place in that regard, between countering enablers and countering business spells. As part of playing the control mirror is you have to have an intuition when you can actually stifle their development and when you have to hit their few cards that matter. In a control mirror, it's probably better to do what he's doing and let these mana rocks resolve, maybe, because he's not doing anything, which means even if I don't resolve these mana rocks, there's a good chance I'm just going to resolve actual lands. And he pitches a land here, which is interesting because he doesn't play a land. He plays Trepanation Blade, which isn't going to do anything for a while. I probably would have pitched that first. Okay, so here's where I decide to move in. I calculate that I have 10 mana available next turn. So I decide this is when I'm going to squeeze out my my victory. So I make my move. I tap top and flip Temporal Mastery here. This creates the miracle effect. My opponent has to decide, is he going to counter this miracle? And he does. But he does so in a way that he taps out. So my top also, it's notable, is gone here because of the milling effect of this counterspell. Alright. So at this point I know I can almost certainly resolve one of these threats unless he has Force of Will. But I get even luckier because I go to cast an Impulse now that the coast is clear for that and grab Mystical Tutor. Those other cards are great, but what Mystical Tutor allows me to do is protect the card I'm about to slam by grabbing Force of Will. So I untap, I get my Coalition Relic counter, I have 10 mana, and slam Omniscience. And he doesn't have any way to stop it. It would have required maybe days plus Force or Pact there, but he doesn't get it. And at this point, he doesn't know it, but the game's pretty much over. I start by casting Temporal Manipulation, then Jace for free, use the draw effect, put it back right, and Stroke of Genius, play the island, play the Glenolendra for free. I now have counter protection against most of the cards that matter. There's Ponder. There's my extra turn. I stroke for a bunch while being able to leave up Glenolendra. And as I said, the game is pretty much over here. He doesn't necessarily know it yet. Here I Bribery. I don't see anything that great, so I decide just to grab Elishnorn and start trying to close this game out quickly. Second main, more free spells. Jace, put back some stuff, Gilded Lotus. Pass turn. And as I said, the game is almost certainly over here. I have 2 counter spells, a Glenolendra Archmage. He discards God's Willing, which isn't doing anything. He casts Pillar of Light, exiling Elishnorn. That is not a spell I need to counter. He casts Arrest on the Glenolendra Archmage, which I think is fine because I can just Riptide Laboratory it. And that's the point. He decides he's had enough. I can keep replaying the Archmage. I have these cards in my hand. Also, I can just start capsizing his lands back to his hand and basically just destroy his entire board. So that Omniscience pretty much single-handedly won the game. So this is a good illustration of kind of this control-on-control matchup again. There's a lot of draw-go. You kind of have to pick your spots. And it's also an example of picking a plan and sticking to that plan over the course of the game unless you're given a reason you have to switch. So in my game, I faced kind of a pivotal decision point. I kept drawing cards that are great in these control mirrors, but interfered with my plan to set up a miracle Temporal Mastery on top of my library. And there certainly is an argument for just saying screw it and starting to cast Impulse and Stroke of Genius at the end of their turn. Setting up a massive stroke like that would have probably also forced his hand and enabled me to slam a threat down the next turn. But in this case, I knew he was going to be choked on mana if he ever cast his commander. And I decided that this plan was probably going to be the best. And that would still give me access to these other cards once once Omniscience hit the table. And it would also give me a backup plan if something went horribly wrong with the first plan. If you go with the stroke plan, you're kind of done if that falls apart. If you go with the Temporal Mastery and he counters the Temporal Mastery, you're really just in the same position you start with. So You'll notice that that Temporal Mastery came on maybe turn 6. I'd have to go back and look. And it wasn't until maybe turn 15 that I actually executed. One key thing I cannot stress enough, and this is not unique to Commander, this is true in pretty much any game where it's Drago versus Drago, is you have to be patient. My opponent did the right thing in one case, even discarding a card rather than do anything foolish and try and force through a threat. The worst thing you can do is tapping out into counterspells, because that enables them to untap and slam their threat without resistance. My opponent and I kind of did what I think is the right thing. You try and resolve these smaller threats. You resolve things like Mana Rocks or Monastery Siege, things you can cast and protect, and then just wait for your big spells. Wait for that eventual counter war and find a way. Usually the way you win is by casting an end of turn threat or must deal with spell, and then untap and cast another one. And most of the time they're going to have a hard time dealing with that. In this case, even if I didn't have that omniscience, I would have been able to untap, cast that temporal manipulation, and then the Jace, and get another extra turn, and probably still close this game out. Maybe with a little more time than I would have with this omniscience, but the principle is still the same. So hopefully you learned a lot from this game, and hopefully we can get another couple videos. Maybe we'll even be able to get one without a control deck on the other end. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week.